I want to ask you a question, and that is, what is in your life's blueprint? This is the most important and crucial period of your lives, for what you do now may well determine which way your life shall go.
My presentation is going to focus on Martin Luther King's speech called Life's Blueprint. And it's so powerful to think about the legacy that Martin Luther King has left and how that legacy is still present today. And in this speech, I'd like to give you some context. He's speaking in front of high school students in Philadelphia. And the audience was predominantly African Americans. So in the context of his speech, some of his references are based on his audience. But the theme are so general enough that it applies to anybody today.
And whenever a building is constructed, you usually have an architect who draws a blueprint. And that blueprint serves as the pattern, as the guide for those who are to build the building. And a building is not well erected without a good, sound, and solid blueprint.
There's a thing that he says in his presentation where he says the mind is the standard of a man. In this context, man holistic, so it's not just man as man, but man as human being. You know, a lot of times what's in us, sometimes it doesn't come out to fruition, right? Like we might have positive intentions around how we want to treat people, how we show up. But just think about this, right? Imagine the last time your parents told you, hey, I want you to clean the dishes, or I want you to take the trash out. And you said, yeah, I got you. And then they came back later and they're like, and you're like, oh, I'm so sorry. My intention was to, where your intention doesn't reflect your action. So a lot of times we focus so much on our internal being, which I'm going to call the being, but the doing is actually what we do external. The doing is what people see and feel. So the being is our mindset, right? Internally, how we feel, our perspectives and point of views. And our perspectives and point of views are influenced by so many different things. Where we grew up, where we go to school, the principles that your parents might instill in you, the community, your social circle, right? Your friends. That's your being. Your doing is what you actually do. And a lot of times, if we're on the receiving end of your behavior, I can only tell what you are all about based on what you do. Even if you do a great job of explaining to me, you're just explaining to me. But when you demonstrate it, then I'm like, wow, that's what they do. So if we go back to that statement that I had earlier, bring your positive intention to life to make an impact. And I would say Martin Luther King was an amazing exemplar of that. In this speech, he has 3 principles. So I want to ground us real quick. So I'm going to be talking about the being, which is your mindset, your point of view, your perspective, your internal being of who you are. And I'm going to be talking about the doing, which is what you actually do. So in this speech, he has 3 principles.
Number 1 in your life's blueprint should be a deep belief in your own dignity, your own worth, and your own somebodyness. Don't allow anybody to make you feel that you are nobody. Always feel that you count. Always feel that you have worth. And always feel that your life has ultimate significance. Now that means that you should not be ashamed of your color. You know, it's very unfortunate that in so many instances our society has placed a stigma on the Negro's color. And you know there are some Negroes who are ashamed of themselves. But don't be ashamed of your color. Don't be ashamed of your biological features.
So the first principle, he says, is in your blueprint, you should have a deep belief in your own dignity, in your own worth, and in your own somebodyness. And in the context of his speech, again, he's talking to a predominantly African American audience. And they are high school students. So how did this principle play out in his own being and how he showed up? This image here is from a demonstration that happened the day before Martin Luther King was assassinated. And in this demonstration, he was invited to come and present and speak to over 5,000 different sanitation workers who were doing a demonstration. And something I find very fascinating in this image is the slogan that folks are holding up. And that slogan, it says, "I am a man." And when these folks decided to go out for this demonstration, they wore their Sunday's best. They wore the outfit that they felt best represented who they were. So the notion of somebodyness is a very critical part when we think about our own personal being and how we see ourselves. And in this setting, the folks that you're seeing in this image, they were persecuted, they were treated unfairly, their wages were much, much lower than what they deserved, and they went out in the street in order to demonstrate. And Martin Luther King Jr. was invited to participate in this demonstration. And this was a day before he was assassinated. Here's an image of Martin Luther King during that demonstration. Here's another image of him speaking that night before. So the notion of somebodyness is so critical. Because when you feel that your identity is worth, that you have self-pride and positive self-esteem in how you see yourself, when the tribulation outside starts occurring and happening, you have the opportunity to continue to find stability. And in this case, when we look at where these folks were who were demonstrated, if we look at in comparison to where we are today, some might say, oh, we're in a way, way better position than where they were. But the notion of having that positive self-esteem around how you see yourself is so critical. And that's Martin Luther King's first principle in that speech, having a sense of being, of somebodyness. And that demonstrated over and over and over and over in his work. Do you know 10 years prior to Martin Luther King's assassination, there was an attempt assassination on him? He was out promoting a book that he wrote, and somebody stabbed him right near his heart. A lot of the things that he encountered, for most of us, it might have been things where we would have said, all right, that's it. In concept, in an ideal standpoint, those concepts are great. But in terms of action, most of us would have been like, that's a little too much. Right? Most of us would have been like, that's a good hashtag. Oh, that's a good tile on our Instagram. That's a good reshare. He believed in himself and he believed in the cause that he had. And because of that belief, he endured so much challenges and difficulties. And eventually, those challenges and difficulty led to his life being taken away. So the second principle in his speech focuses on hard work. Being able to show mastery. Working hard to compete at the highest level in the areas that you have interest in.
You're going to be deciding as the days and the years unfold what you will do in life, what your life's work will be. And once you discover what it will be, set out to do it and to do it well. And I say to you, my young friends, that doors are opening to each of you Doors of opportunity are opening to each of you that were not open to your mothers and to your fathers. And the great challenge facing you is to be ready to enter these doors as they open. I would say to you, don't drop out of school, and I understand all of the sociological reasons why we often drop out of school. But I urge you, in spite of your economic plight, in spite of the situation that you are forced to live so often with intolerable conditions, stay in school. And when you discover what you're going to be in life, set out to do it as if God Almighty called you at this particular moment in history to do it.
So how did these principles manifest in Martin Luther King's own life? He was an organizer that was strategic. Part of being strategic is understanding the different moving parts and behaviors of people in order to present a message that's going to motivate and it's going to inspire people to make action. He was a preacher. He was a strategist, communicator, a speaker, and a writer. So here are some of his accomplishments. By the age of 15 years old, he skipped 2 grades and entered college. He graduated from Morehouse at the age of 19, and then went on to Boston University to study systemic theology and graduated by the age of 25 years old. He wrote 5 books, and he was also a Nobel Peace Prize winner in 1964. So the doing, right? We're talking about the being and the doing. So in the first principle, he talks about being somebody, right? Self-worth. And then the second principle, he's talking about action and behavior. In order to achieve what he achieved, he needed to actually do the work. But how did that catapult to greater things? And a lot of times when we think about our being and our doing, sometimes we get caught up with our being, which is great. But the doing is the intersections of where you can bring your ideas and your vision to life. Martin Luther King was arrested, I believe, over 29 times. You know the statistic that's really interesting about Martin Luther King? A lot of times, our history of now doesn't really get catapulted until years and years later. So here's an example. Less than 28% of white Americans were supporters of Martin Luther King at the time Martin Luther King was doing his work. Less than 28%. So the odds were against him at every angle. Even through our own government, the FBI tapped into his home, the hotels that he would travel to. So when we talk about Martin Luther King, sometimes we kind of put him in a box a little bit, right? Because it's the way that we think about history, it might be a little bit more, it's almost like it's like historical but very novelish. So we're like, oh yeah. So our government, the American government, tapped into Martin Luther King everywhere he went because he was a threat. So just to give you some context, right? So imagine if you were so passionate about something where you wanted to change the world, right? You wanted to change the community around you. And what you believe in was so good, so strong, and you felt noble. But less than 28% of the folks around you supported you. And those who have power around you are using their power to make sure that if they feel like they need to tame you, slow you down, work against you, that they can utilize their power to do so. And that was the reality of Martin Luther King every day, every second, while he was fighting for the rights of people that didn't have it. Now let's move on to the third principle. The eternal principle of beauty, love, and justice.
Finally, in your life's blueprint must be a commitment to the eternal principles of beauty, love, and justice. Don't allow anybody to pull you so low as to make you hate them. Don't allow anybody to cause you to lose your self-respect to the point that you do not struggle for justice. However young you are, you have a responsibility to seek to make your nation a better nation in which to live, You have a responsibility to seek to make life better for everybody. And so you must be involved in the struggle for freedom and justice.
So he says, don't allow anybody cause you to lose your self-respect to a point where you do not struggle for justice. He says the internal principle of beauty, love, and justice. So let's talk about a little bit from a macro perspective of what his calling and passions were able to accomplish through justice. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights of 1965. So what did the Civil Rights Act of 1964 accomplish? It prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This is 1964. I know for some of you, you might feel like 1964 was ages and ages ago. This is 1964. This is not 1830s. What else was it able to accomplish? Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed the discriminatory voting practices adopted in many southern states after the Civil War, including literacy tests as a prerequisite to voting. And that's from a national standpoint, right? Many of us benefit from these two incredible laws. And I know today voting rights is a big thing, right? So those are the three principles that I wanted to touch on. How would those principles have played out in my own personal life? I'm going to start off with my being, right? We talked about the being and the doing. So let's start with the being. So my being is influenced by my internal point of view and perspective of how I see the world and me and experiences that I've had. So I grew up in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the heart of Africa. I grew up to a middle-class family, never really experienced war or anything like that. Democratic Republic of Congo is the second largest country in Africa, and we are all connected to the Democratic Republic of Congo. And you all are probably saying, this guy up here is crazy, I'm not connected to the Congo. You all have cell phones, right? 85% of the world's cobalt comes from the Congo. And cobalt is a raw mineral that gets used in order to go into our chip and our battery, and every single phone that you have today has cobalt in it. That's for a different presentation. I'll come back another time. So I grew up for a middle-class family, never really worried about anything, until 1997, a huge civil war broke out. And during that civil war, my father ended up getting assassinated, and my family found ourselves figuring out how we're going to survive, and we found ourselves at a refugee camp in Benin in Western Africa. After 2 years living in a refugee camp, we found ourselves in Manchester, New Hampshire, the coldest place on earth in February. So we went from the heart of Africa, where the equator goes across, to New Hampshire, literally in the weather like this. So when I talk about my being is influenced by where I came from and what I've experienced, right? So I want to stay on that theme, so we're making sense, because you all have your being and is influenced by many different things. Never spoke English. I grew up speaking Swahili, Lingala, and French. In school, I learned in French. Moved to America, didn't know the language, didn't speak anything, didn't have any friends and families, nothing, except the hope of a second life, the freedom to start my life again. You know what's interesting in life? If you ever get to a dire situation where you feel like you're surviving by the minute or by the hour, when you get that second chance where you don't have to worry about that anymore, it changes your perspective on how you see yourself, or even how you see surviving. And my family and I, we had that second chance. The richest country in the world. A lot of folks that came alongside my family and I didn't look like us, didn't smell like us, had different preferences, didn't cook food that we liked or that we knew. But they built relationship with us. And the relationship that they built, it made us believe that we can actually survive and succeed in this new country. So some of the pictures that you're seeing, that's literally the first couple of months of us being in America. So as part of my being, as I started to get acclimated, I started to develop new perspective and point of views of who I was and what I aspired to be. From a socio-economic standpoint, I grew up in a middle-class family in the Congo, never really had to worry about basic needs. Moved to America, lost everything I had and had to start from scratch, a single mother with 4 children. We didn't have the best socioeconomics, but we learned how to be resourceful. Dance and music became an outlet for me to connect and build a relationship with people. And as I found my identity through dance and music, I was able to represent what I thought and who I thought I was as I continued to move forward. I joined an organization where I traveled all over America. I would give up my summers, and I started to learn about different communities, from East Side, West Side Chicago, East Side, West Side Philly, Madison, Wisconsin, Jamaica, Queens, Brooklyn, all over. And one of the things that I noticed was my community in New Hampshire was very different than the community that I went as part of this program. And literally what you're seeing in the pictures, that was my experience for about 13 years, where I would give up my summer and work with communities all over the country. And through those experiences, it started to inform my being and how I thought about my existence in America based on experiences of other people had. So when we talk about my being, I hope you're seeing the connection, how my being has transformed over time. I work with communities all over, and my story became a story that brought hope and perspectives and encouragement for people all over. And the more that I saw that my story was bringing hope, the more I gravitated in finding different outlets to do that through music, storytelling, different things. So that's my being. Grew up in the Congo. My father was assassinated, lost everything, moved to a new country, had to start from scratch, grew up in a predominantly white space, where I had to confront a lot of different things as a African American from the Congo who had to represent who he was and where he came from. Started to travel by the time I was 12 years old for 13 years straight after that, working with inner city organizations all over the country. So the reason I'm telling you this story is I want you to understand the difference between the being and the doing. And I want you to also understand, right? So when I tell the story from my own perspective, that's my story and what I lived. Yes, I experienced a lot of hardship throughout that journey. But remember what I told you earlier, I had a second chance of life. I shouldn't even be here in America. But my story is my story. Your story is your story. And you all have your own story that shapes you. You have your own things that shapes your being. And I'm sure all of you here, you have positive intentions. There's intentions that live within you when you think about it that they're positive. But unfortunately, sometimes those positive intentions don't come to life. And we all have different privileges. Different access to different resources. And some of those resources are tangible, some of those resources are internal, and how we feel and how we think of ourselves. But your being is so important because your being is a source of what ignites what you do. And as much as we have positive intentions, we also have negative intentions that are influenced by fear, protections, preconceived notions that have been instilled in you from various of influences. So when we go back to Martin Luther King's story, we look at time and time again where he had to stand up for what he believed was right. Yes, there's times where he dropped the ball. There's times where he wasn't perfect. Just like the same way, there's times when you drop the ball. And there's times that you're not going to be perfect. But the opportunity is how we come alongside each other. Just like in my story I told you, those families that came alongside me, They made an important impact in my life. And the communities and the people that came alongside Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders, they made a big impact in building the momentum that they needed in order to see changes like the rights that I mentioned earlier that were made. So, I told you that I was going to switch the table and bring it back to you. The important part today is you. Not me, but you. So here's a moment. If you can reflect on your being, what influences your being? What influences who you are? When you think about your priorities, right? You all have your little buttons. What are the buttons that doesn't really matter, and what are the buttons that do matter? Because the reality is, in the world that we're in today, everyone has a voice to express how they feel. Because of that, we're seeing the friction at real time. Through social media, through posts. And our society is forcing us to pick sides. That's what our society is doing. Our politicians, our friend groups, our comedians, the authors that we read. But we all have an opportunity here. We're never going to see each other eye to eye on everything. That's just the reality. But if you believe another human being that's sitting next to you has the right to exist and live and breathe the same air that you have, then it's your opportunity to reflect on how you show up. So when we think about Martin Luther King, we think about how you show up. So, my question to you, when it comes to your being, when you think about your own personal blueprint, when you think about your being, is your being influenced by a learning mindset? So you're probably asking, what do you mean by a learning mindset? I know I'm at Phillips Exeter Academy, right? You all are super smart. But let me also tell you a little thing. You don't know what you don't know. When you come from a learning mindset, it's important to realize that you don't know what you don't know. Because what that does is it creates space to learn from those who are around you. And when I'm saying around you, I don't mean just figuratively physical spaces. We live in a global world, right? If you all open your phone in seconds, we can know what's happening in Zimbabwe and Australia by seconds, right? But a lot of times we're looking at things in the lens of ours. That's the starting point, obviously. But it's the absolutism that we carry with us where we feel if it doesn't match or meet who I am, then therefore those on the other side are wrong. And if you don't live that experience, if you don't have the space to recognize, as smart as you are, you don't know what you don't know, then there's no room to grow and learn. And if we're not leading by that, regardless of what data you might have read from a research or data from your TikTok or a data from, there's still a disattachment to those who might be close to you that are saying, hey, this is my experience. This is how I want to be treated. When you say this, this is how it impacts me. Some of us are, we live in a PC world, everybody's so soft now. Politically correct world. Everybody is so soft, meaning they're sensitive to things. But when we start from a point of view where we understand that we don't know what we don't know, then it's an opportunity for us to learn. As much as America influences the rest of the world, there's still the rest of the world. So there's an opportunity for us to learn. But you know the craziest thing? So let's go back to the civil rights era. Let's go back to Martin Luther King's time. You know what he was labeled? He had a lot of labels. And a lot of times people wanted to bypass the core of what he was advocating for than the label that he was given. So from a national standpoint, right, this whole notion of he was a communist, he had communist idea and ideology. So when he's coming in advocating for sanitation employees that are not getting paid right, that are not getting treated right, it's much easier to focus on the narrative that you feel like will bypass people's ability to actually hear him out on the stuff that's impactful. So you say, oh, that's the guy with the communist ideology. That's how Martin Luther King, the Martin Luther King that we're celebrating today, right? That's how he was depicted. And it might not take you too long if you pull up your phone and you start Googling different articles and different cartoon illustration that Martin Luther King was depicted during that time. All right, so first, in your being, having a mindset of learning, that you don't know what you don't know. Be intentional in getting to know yourself. See, a lot of times we focus so much external, some of us don't actually really spend that much time of getting to know who you actually are. What was Martin Luther King's first principle in the message?
Somebodyness.
Woo! That somebodyness is you. Not your persona that you put out on TikTok or Instagram. We do a lot of surveys in school. 75% of surveys that we do when we ask high school students if their persona on their social media is an accurate depiction of who they are, 75% says no. And I'm sure that might be true here too. So if the starting point is for you to be able to reflect, who are you? What influences you? What makes you tick? What are you passionate about? What do you care about? What are the drivers that are driving how you see the world around you? Because that introspective of reflecting will give you a guide of where am I aligned with your positive intentions? And where am I not aligned with your positive intention, where there actually might be negative things that are influencing you? The people that are close to you, they know. They see the good and the bad that comes out. So that's the starting point. Reflect on who you are. Write it down. Figure it out. What are the influences? Oh, maybe I was... And then importantly, what are you protecting? We all have our walls, right? You know a lot of negative narrative that's out there for people that try to come to this country? A lot of times people say the illegals, right? The negative narrative is created by so many different things. People say, oh, they're here, they're trying to take our jobs, or we're trying. And then some people make it personal. They come up with other reasons, right? What are the things that you have walls? How does it show up? Because when we talk about social justice, we're so quick to think about the external. The external is influenced by behaviors, and the behaviors are coming from each individual. And each individual has their own moving parts of how they're attached to certain things. What are you willing to do? Martin Luther King Jr. was a doer, and your doing will manifest around the community that you're in. When it comes to people that are similar from you, how do you see them? What makes you feel trusting? Oh, I trust them. I feel comfortable. What about from the people that are different from you? What makes you put your walls up? And different, I can sit here and give all the different examples of difference. Hopefully that's good enough when I say difference for you to think of what's different. Now let's move to the doing. Are you creating and experimenting? Thinking outside of the box and learning skills you need to do. Are you involved in communities to make things better? Your school, places at home, your social community. Some of you, like maybe 65% of your community is virtual. If you're a gamer on Twitch, You know, the sound bites that we hear influences us. So a lot of time when my team and I get brought in at schools, if there's a racial incident, when we start diving deeper with the individuals, I hear that word a lot when I'm playing video game on Twitch. And you know where, for the adults, you know where they say that their manifestation of derogatory words come from? Jokes, movies. Oh, you know, I just realized there's a comedian that I was listening to and I'm so sorry. So what are you hearing, right? What are the narrative that you're hearing that might not be true, but it's actually true in the way that you have taken it in? Because a lot of times we want to be like in this autopilot of just like, but your environment and what you consume does influence you. And if you can't put a pause and reflect on it, and before you know it, things that you say, how you act, how you show up, it's a completely opposite of it. And then you forget, become super defensive. You're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they think I'm this person. Well, some of your behavior might reflect that person. If you don't like that person, then it's an opportunity for you to change. Your blueprint. There's the being, there's the doing. The being is your mindset, your internal feelings and emotions of what shapes you and how you feel and how you see the world around you. The doing is what you do. In order to have a blueprint, hopefully we all are inspired to have a blueprint that's going to make an impact. And sometimes the beneficiary of that impact might not be you, it might be others. And when we think about Martin Luther King's legacy, his blueprint made us such a big impact that many, many, many people have benefited from that, like me, an immigrant that moved here from the Democratic Republic of Congo after my father was assassinated and had to start from scratch. So, for my closing today, I know I did this whole dance. I wanted to make it tangible, because at the end of the day, the responsibility is all on you. We could be passive and never take ownership of our negative actions and behavior, or we could be intentional in taking ownership. And when we drop the ball, not if, when we drop the ball, we have the ability to reflect and understand that we don't know what we don't know. And we create the space to learn, to continue to learn, and show up in a way that we can make an impact. So thank you so much. I appreciate you joining me for my presentation today. What is your blueprint? Thank you.